The central problem here is how white Americans, while claiming to be anti-racist, are somehow able to acquire and to share with one another negative stereotypes that they use, consciously or unconsciously, to justify the subordination and oppression of people of color. These stereotypes must circulate among them in discourse and everyday language that's made public in talk and text. Now, negative stereotypes can, of course, be acquired without discourse by mere gaze, where black and brown faces dominate the American street scene. The white gaze can often instead observe a background of unpainted and sagging buildings or abandoned vehicles, graffitied walls, um, weedy vacant lots or poorly stocked shops, where the price of the purchase is passed to the clerk, not across a friendly counter with displays of small items for impulse purchase, but in a revolving tray through bulletproof plastic. Now, not understanding the history of residential segregation, or how it drains wealth from communities of color, or how this erodes a community's capacity for maintaining decent neighborhoods and controlling crime, white Americans conclude that the disorder before their eyes reveals that people of color are deficient as citizens. But the uninformed white gaze, forming stereotypes through first-hand observations of how people of color live in the United States, really can't be the most important source of racist ideas. Most white Americans live and work far from those neighborhoods and have little contact with people of color. So indirect sources of information are probably much more important for white Americans. And those include casual conversations with other whites, information circulated officially and unofficially in institutions like schools and workplaces, and especially representations of all types of media. Now, among media representations, visual images are immensely important, and biases that convey um, these images have been really carefully studied by specialists. But my training is in the analysis of text and talk, so that's how I look at the ways racism is reproduced through those channels. So I use the term discourse as shorthand for all varieties of text and talk. But when I say discourse, I include the actual material presence in both the structure and the content of language in use in history and at particular moments of human interaction. So it's in these material presences that ideas actually live. And it's through these that people acquire and share knowledge. Now, knowledge and ideas are made available in discourse not simply through material presence, what's there, what we actually say and what we hear. They're also made available in absences. Absences. We can think of the material surface of discourse, of our talk, as partly a set of explicit articulations, but also as a set of suggestive gaps that trigger inferences and connections among the stretches of explicit utterance. So, the analysis of discourse requires us to examine not only what is said, but what's not said. So let me give you an example that I was going to try to give you earlier today, and I got discombobulated, but I kind of thought about this more clearly. So a while back, when I was a doc student and I lived in Tucson, I visited my Social Security office, which was fortunately located only 4 blocks from my house, to resolve a problem. When I was waiting, a white woman sat down next to me, and she said voluntarily, I had to drive 2 hours to get here. When I was finally admitted to the inner office for an interview, I mentioned to the interviewer that someone in the waiting room had told me that she had driven 2 hours and asked what the surface area of the office was. The interviewer was a brown-skinned woman whose ethnicity wasn't obvious to me, and her last name implied no obvious affiliation, said something very close to this. Oh, we get that all the time. People come up here all the way from Green Valley because they don't want to go to our South Tucson office. We can't make them go to the office closest to their homes. So I said, oh, I think I know what you're saying. Now, this is now what she did not say. And even though you don't know Tucson, I hope my explanation will give you that context. What she didn't say was this: Green Valley is a set of retirement communities inhabited almost entirely by relatively conservative white people. South Tucson is an almost all Latino community, and in fact, the whole south side of Tucson metropolitan area is heavily Latino and Native American. A white woman in the waiting room in the Social Security office in South Tucson would probably be very much in the minority. There were quite a few people of color waiting in the waiting room of the office I was in, the North Campbell office. But whites were the majority there. Now, the interviewer's utterance did not make any of that explicit. By the time of my question, she knew I had lived at my present address for quite a while. So her utterance invited me to apply my local knowledge of the racial makeup of the communities and the kind of attitudes that would make someone drive for 2 hours to get to North Campbell Avenue instead of perhaps 30 minutes to reach South Tucson. Now, having made those inferences, I realized that my interviewer had really said a mouthful in addition to her actual words. So, in summary, when I use the word discourse, I don't mean just the material surface of language, although this publicly available surface, what we refer to as the linguistic sign itself, what we hear or see, is absolutely crucial because it triggers all the meaning creating activity accomplished in communication. But I include as well the invitations and clues, the silences, the inferences, and the literal content of a text or an utterance. So I assume that deep principles determine what components of the message are explicit and what components are recovered through inference. Among the most important of these principles are linguistic ideology.